I know how it feels to be someone's monster or be this mythical thing. Some people talk about Jews as if we're like a myth, like finding an elf in the woods or something. Dealing with people and their assumptions and prejudices. Yeah, just living it for sure has made me want to create those characters and writing from their point of view.
This is The Book of Life, a show about Jewish kidlit, mostly. I'm Heidi Rabinowitz. Welcome to my Creature Double Feature two-part series about anti-Semitism and the supernatural. My guest is Deke Moulton, author of Don't Want to Be Your Monster, which is about vampires, and Benji Zeb Is a Ravenous Werewolf, which is, you guessed it, about werewolves. These books go beyond simple adventures with supernatural heroes. I love how they both delve deeply into the very nature of prejudice. I love how they both imagine worlds in which kids defeat hate. And they are also fun, fast-paced magical adventure stories. It's a win-win. My other Creature Double Feature episode is an interview with Emmy Watanabe Cohen about her Dragon and Golem middle grade novels, which make great companions to Deke's books. You will find links to that episode, to Deke's website, Deke's reading suggestions, a transcript, and more at bookoflifepodcast.com, where you can also leave a comment or email me to let me know your thoughts about vampires, werewolves, or anything else. Deke Moulton, I am so glad to talk with you. We've been trying to set up a conversation for months, but life kept getting in the way. So, welcome to the Book of Life podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. Oh my goodness, so many cancellations and rescheduling, but thank you.
Here we are at last. Deke, I read your interview at the Horror Writers Association blog, and it mentioned some very interesting experiences, quote, from being a punk rock hitchhiker living on top of buildings to an ancient book conservator apprentice at the Adler Planetarium, to living in a college learning Arabic, to even being a drill sergeant with the U.S. Army. So, did we miss anything? And how have those experiences contributed to your writing?
My life is just fun and busy and full of experiences. And every single piece of that somehow finds its way into my writing and my books. I lived in Italy for 3.5 years, my first duty station. And then I was at the Arabic school, which is like a live-in university, and you're in classes 7 hours a day for 1.5 years, nonstop, super fast, exceedingly high fail-out rate. Like I have characters that are Italian and I have characters that are Sudanese because so many of my professors were Sudanese Arabs. Pertaining to my new release, Benji Zeb Is, I spent the first 6 years of my life living on a communal farm outside of Chicago. Very kibbutz-like. I have so many fond memories of that, and that really inspired me to write Benji Zeb taking place on an actual kibbutz. Everything in my life somehow finds its way into these books.
You've written 2 books about supernatural creatures, a vampire book and a werewolf book. So can you give us a quick plot summary for each book and tell us the inspiration behind each book?
Yeah, my first book is Don't Want to Be Your Monster, which follows 2 vampire brothers. They stumble upon a murder. The older brother, Victor, really is like, whatever, mortals hate us, they want to kill us, I could care less. If they're being murdered, that's guilt-free blood, like who cares? And the younger brother, Adam, who was born Jewish and not really raised Jewish by his vampire family, he feels this stronger connection to mortals and wanting to use his supernatural abilities to maybe hunt down the murderer and try to protect the mortals, even if they don't like vampires. And when they find out that the murderer is actually a vampire hunter who is murdering people as bait to try to draw them out, that really complicates things as they work together to try to track down this killer. As far as like inspiration, I just always loved adventure stories and uncovering mysteries and escaping danger and making friends. All of these elements of a really good middle grade story. But I really wanted to also touch on these things, not just vampires and not just Jewish history, but there's so many times in which we use mythology to hurt others. And I think it's so deeply ingrained in our culture that it's really hard to untangle the origins of that. Like witches, for instance, a lot of these monsters are really tied in a way to harm others. In my vampire mythology, they are not just predatory, parasitic bloodsuckers, but I created a mythology where they can heal through blood magic, like they can actually draw out sicknesses from people. So they actually had a very symbiotic relationship with people that was twisted to look evil. And I think a lot of people could probably relate to that idea of taking positive things about your community and having it twisted to be misrepresented. So yeah, not just a vampire story. Betsy Bird reviewed it and actually said, like, a book about vampires should not actually be this good. And I have had so many people that they were like, oh, I didn't realize it was going to actually be something bigger than just vampires.
I love that.
Thank you.
Tell us a little bit about Benji Zeb.
Yeah, Benji Zeb is about a family of Jewish werewolves. They operate a wolf sanctuary in a kibbutz-like style to give themselves a safe place to shift where people aren't shocked to see wolves running around. At the center of it all is our protagonist, Benji Zeb, who is struggling with a lot of anxiety. He is hiding a queer crush. And slowly things in his community are starting to fall apart, and he has to deal with all of those things and become someone that he wasn't comfortable being. That's the really quick sum up. Just naturally, after writing vampires, you just write about werewolves. It was fun to have that as a starting point and then figuring out what kind of book I was going to write after that.
So then, after vampires, it's werewolves.
Yeah.
So, in Don't Want to Be Your Monster, the vampire book, Adam is a Jewish character, but the Judaism is not as central to the story. In the werewolf book, in Benji Zeb, Jewish identity is really central and important to the plot. So can you talk about that evolution between one book and the other?
I started writing Don't Want to Be Your Monster in December of 2019. And in September 2019, I read Anya and the Dragon, which blew my mind. The idea that you could write a book about dragons in like a medieval European setting, like this classic fantasy type setting, and then just have a Jewish character who was very Jewish. That was just completely revolutionary for me and my writing. I was still very nervous about writing Jewish characters and Jewish themes. In the past, my characters were Jewish to me, but not obviously so. And I remember when I was talking with my editor, doing a Zoom call before we officially signed on, and he asked if I would be comfortable making it more Jewish. And I literally started crying. My agent at the time had asked me to remove a lot of the Jewish references because she said the analogies didn't feel right and they weren't landing the way I wanted them to. So as soon as my editor took over, I literally copied and pasted everything right back in that I had taken out. My editor really encouraged me, play up on these Jewish themes. I really, really like these parts. So a lot of it is literally, I feel like, partly luck of the draw of finding an editor who truly wanted to encourage that. So I think once Don't Want to Be Your Monster was on its way, we had sold that as a 2-book deal. So I felt even more emboldened. Like, if these are the only 2 books I ever get published, I am going to make this very Jewish. And just the starting point of having Jewish werewolf mythology as my starting point, building it up from the ground up into a living world. I really wanted everything about the book to be very Jewish. and don't want to be your monster. It was more like, here's this European mythology that we're going to deconstruct.
So I just wanted to tell you that I actually interviewed Sophia Pasternak when Anya and the Dragon was new.
Yeah.
So you can go back and listen to that on the podcast.
Oh my gosh, I will. I will. Like, seriously, I remember reading it and crying at the Shabbat scene or the braiding challah scene. They weren't emotional scenes, but it was so shocking to me and so validating to be like, this can be in a book. I grew up with all of a kind family, and it's great to have immigrant stories from the turn of the last century, but I just never really liked those books growing up. I loved the adventure books, and that was just so mind-blowing to read that.
I'll put a link in the show notes to the Anya and the Dragon interview, and maybe I'll dig up some other past episodes about fantasy books because there have been several. So I'll put together a book list and that'll be in the show notes.
Oh, that would be lovely. Yeah. And it could be partly I just wasn't aware of some of these. I literally didn't really start reading until 2019. For the longest time, as an author, I was like, no, I need to have my own voice. If I read other people's books, it'll distort my unique voice. And then as soon as I start reading, I was so much better as a writer. So there could have been many that I missed.
I will say that most of the Jewish fantasy is fairly recent.
Oh, good.
You're not really behind. This may be the smoothest incorporation of Torah study into an adventure story that I've ever heard. And I love how Benji's Devar Torah for his bar mitzvah just sort of surfaces out of events and becomes the point of the story and helps him push back against anti-Semitism. So can you talk about that element of the plot?
Yeah, the Jewish werewolf mythology is built upon the blessing of Benjamin. So Benjamin is a ravenous wolf. In the morning, he defeats the foe, and in the evening, he divides the spoils. And if that is the blessing for werewolves, and I'm writing a Jewish werewolf novel, I really wanted that to be the key plot and struggling with what it means and the duality of it. So the book starts out with that blessing, and I just really wanted to develop a story where there are enemies to fight. And how do you defeat enemies and incorporate them back into community? Not just you're evil, you need to be shunned, you have no opportunity to learn and grow, you will always be shamed, into this idea of, no, we'll divide the spoils. I guess the idea of breaking down and building back up. But just knowing that blessing was the foundation of Jewish werewolf myth, I really wanted the entire thematic journey of the book to revolve around that as well. Which, fits in when you have a character who's studying for his bar mitzvah.
On top of being a Jewish werewolf hiding his wolfiness, Benji Zeb also has anxiety, as you mentioned.
Yeah.
Why was it important to you to include this mental health issue in the book?
Similar to Benji Zeb, I also have anxiety that was untreated for most of my life. There's a scene later in the book where he has a panic attack. That is literally my panic attack I wrote down. I literally was taking notes afterwards. It really manifested during my time in service, and it's a whole other topic of conversation, the way in which injury is dealt with in a military setting. It's very much seen as a moral failing on your part. Like, good people don't get hurt. So there's a lot of stigma about physical injuries on top of mental and behavioral health injuries. I had anxiety growing up, and it wasn't until I was an adult and I start having panic attacks very regularly, and I had to walk in on behavioral health here at JBLM, and I don't know what's wrong. I can't handle normal things. I would get a call and literally jump. I would get a text and literally start shaking. It really made me very aware of how difficult it can be to speak about these kind of things. Middle school is a time where everything that makes you different is up on display, and people pick at every little thing that's wrong and bring it to everyone's attention. I really wanted to show that despite anxiety, that you can still do really incredible things. And it's important to seek help. I have anxiety resources in the book, things that really helped me in very tangible ways, things that you don't have to see a professional for, like box breathing or journaling. And a kid might see themselves in Benji, but are too scared to tell their parents. There's things they can do in the privacy of their own room to help them. And that was really, really important to me, to show that you can struggle with things and that doesn't define you. It's just something you really need to address, but it won't prevent you from doing wonderful things in your life.
It's so helpful when authors share their personal experience and how they've managed to deal with difficulties. It's good role modeling to the readers.
Yeah.
Both of these fantasy novels are, kind of remarkably, tools in the fight against anti-Semitism. So how did you get started down that path?
Bram Stoker, the author of Dracula, was very anti-Semitic in his personal life. Anti-Semitic tropes work their way into vampire mythology, and people don't want to separate those aspects from the myth itself because it's become so intrinsic to it. And I just really wanted to play with those ideas and deconstruct them. I was a little too old to get into Twilight. I was never like a huge vampire fan. I felt not so strongly attached to the mythology, which really allowed me a lot of freedom to play around with it. I think it was a little bit different for werewolves because once I learned that there is an actual werewolf mythology in Judaism, it was just like, oh my goodness, it just kind of wrote itself. So it was fun to completely abandon almost all werewolf mythology because I had something there to begin with. And I know Judaism has vampire mythology too, but I kind of liked really adhering to the more universal European vampire myth when I was playing around with that.
Both of your books include fascinating author's notes that explain about the supernatural creatures, but also about how they represent prejudice and just generally where prejudice comes from. And all readers should absolutely read these author's notes. They are fascinating. But in the meantime, can you give us the short version right now?
For Don't Want to Be Your Monster, the author's note there was really talking about the way if you have never met someone who is different in a particular way, you're very susceptible to the way others talk about them. And these ideas of what other people are may not be based at all on that group itself. For Benji Zeb, I think the big thing for me in that author's note was talking about the way in which marginalized groups are said to never benefit the larger society. And I really wanted to show all the things we use every single day. I talked about Jewish American inventors and innovators, as well as Chinese American innovators and inventors, and show that everything we do every single day is a product of so many different marginalized communities. But that author's note is very much about the way that we are susceptible to believing that marginalized groups are a drain upon society. I mean, and this is why we have Jewish American Heritage Month and Asian American Heritage Month. It's to try to draw this attention to the contributions that people have had on our everyday lives and on big moments in history. So that was basically that author's note.
As you researched vampires and werewolves, you must have learned a lot of interesting things. Can you share some of that with us?
I always thought that Dracula was the first vampire book. I was very shocked to find out that there was actually this huge vampire novel scene, and most of them focused on lesbians, which I thought was completely wild because it's Victorian England. But a lot of those original books were very, very queer. I did make my vampire parents lesbian moms kind of as a nod to that origin of vampire mythology, but I was just shocked. There had been years of vampire books being written before Bram Stoker wrote Dracula. And he was actually kind of trying to find his way to be super famous. That was like his entire personality. So he was writing on the popularity of vampire myths when he wrote Dracula. He didn't create it. He was like, oh, that's really cool. I'm going to throw my hat in. There's not a lot of research with Jewish werewolf mythology. So I got to play a lot in there. There was ideas that I included, like a werewolf keeps its own mind when it shifts because werewolves are still created in the image of God. So I love that idea. Jewish culture has such a rich diversity of demons and troublemakers, but they didn't include werewolves. They didn't think that werewolves were part of that, which I thought was just very cool.
Well, it's interesting thinking about Dracula, for example. Both of your books are from the point of view of the so-called monsters, the vampires or the werewolves, and they are the heroes, not the villains of the books. Talk about that choice.
I think that was just a natural choice as a Jewish author. In my time in the army, I was always somebody's first Jew. It was really funny meeting people and they're like, I've never met a Jew before. And then learning what they thought I was and just kind of laughing like, oh my God, where did you learn this? And it was always like really strange things, and not everyone was like anti-Semitic. Some people just, it was very innocent. So I have this already lived experience of being this thing that I'm not and being told, well, that's what you are. And sitting there and trying to say, like, none of that is true. I think one thing that was very important about my time in service is that you're forced to work with people that you would never spend time with normally. You grow to know people, they grow to know you, and it allows for these really interesting ways of getting to know people from all over the world. And not saying that everyone walks away from military service profoundly positively affected, but for me, I just felt like, wow, I would never have sat and had a conversation with someone who started off by saying, Hitler did a lot of things right. And like,
yikes.
Then being like, okay, I am literally forced to sit in an office with you and we're going to talk about this for years because you're stuck in a unit for years. Those experiences were so profound. And when I wanted to write vampires, that is definitely the reason behind those choices is I know how it feels to be someone's monster or be this mythical thing. Some people talk about Jews as if we're like a myth, like finding an elf in the woods or something. Dealing with people and their assumptions and prejudices, just living it for sure has made me want to create those characters and writing from their point of view.
I love the title, Don't Want to Be Your Monster, because to me, that's the message that I want to put out into the world right now.
Mm-hmm.
People who are thinking of Jews as monstrous, as boogeymen.
Yeah.
We don't want to be their monster. We need them to understand that that's not what we are. So, I think both of these books do a lot of good in conveying that message.
Thank you.
And that title is like a slogan that I want to adopt.
And it's funny because that wasn't the original title. The original title was Youngblood. Penguin Random House published a young adult book called Youngblood the summer before mine came out. It came across my Twitter feed and I just immediately emailed my editor like, I think we should change the title. Everything that references a don't want to be your monster thing was literally added after the fact, last minute additions.
Well, it worked out well.
Oh, yeah. I love the idea of adversity not always being negative, but helping to develop something new and creative. And like if it wasn't for that book being published, Don't Want to Be Your Monster would have been slightly different.
That's amazing how a book that's not your book, that's not even by an author you necessarily know, is impacting how your book comes out.
Yes, I love the direction that it took, and I'm so much happier with the title. I think my editor even looked it up, and he's like, on Goodreads, there's 1,200 books called Youngblood. It's just one of those things where a perfectly normal thing happening really diverted the direction my book was going. I also really love the idea of don't want to be your monster. I don't want to play that role. I won't play that role. I am so happy that these things happened the way they did.
Both your books take place in the Pacific Northwest, which is famously known as vampire and werewolf country because of the Twilight books.
Yes.
Is there something about that landscape out there that makes it a good setting for these sort of stories, or is it just a coincidence because that's where you live?
It is a huge coincidence. I was stationed at JBLM Joint Base Lewis McChord, and it is a joint base between the Air Force, that's McChord Field, and Fort Lewis, which is the Army base. So it is a hugely massive military installation here in Washington State. And that was the last duty station I was assigned to before I medically retired. The way that the military goes is you often can suggest where you would like to go, but you don't have full choice. JBLM was my third choice. I wanted to go back overseas, and then I wanted to go to a base in Colorado. Those were not available. So I came here, and just showing up in the Pacific Northwest, I'm like, oh my God, I love the trees. I love the overcastness. There's a line in Benji Zeb that says it feels like a soft, fleecy blanket over the sky. For me, it's very cozy. I'm not like a really big sunshine person, which I guess makes me a little bit more like vampires. It was just all coincidence. But then there were things with vampires that actually living in the Pacific Northwest would be great. There's no real thunderstorms here. So the idea of being very sensitive to lights or sounds. The temperature is very moderate. My idea is vampires would be very sensitive to heat and just stuff like that, like little playful details, but all coincidental. It's literally because I moved here.
Okay, it's just interesting that that's the region where a lot of these stories are set.
When you come here, though, it is so magical. The forests beckon the imagination. It is truly a wonderful landscape to be an author, especially with things like supernatural stories.
Hey, Book of Life listeners. I'm giving an online talk for my local public library, and you are invited. Join me online on Wednesday, November 20th, 2024 at 7 p.m. Eastern Time for Cheering on Jewish Books, a talk about how Jewish literature can save the world by pushing back against anti-Semitism with practical tips for supporting Jewish books and recommendations for excellent Jewish titles that you will want to read. Registration opens on November 6th, 2024. Just follow the link in the show notes at bookoflifepodcast.com. I hope to see you there. Now, back to our creature double feature conversation. So another recent Jewish fantasy middle grade novel is Golem Crafters by Emmy Watanabe Cohen, who is appearing on another episode of the Book of Life as a part of this creature double feature arc. So Faye, the main character in Golem Crafters, says, kind of bitterly, Jewish kids don't get to have a Narnia.
Ooh.
So as a Jewish fantasy writer yourself, do you think that that's true? And if so, why?
I think so much of our literature is based on trauma. So much of Jewish kidlit is Holocaust based. I don't know if our entire perception of the world is just different. So much of our culture is present in everything we do and everything we think, the way that we see the world, the way we interact with conflict. And I mean, Narnia was written as an escape book during World War II. I'm just trying to think of Narnia itself. And I mean, I understand that that book was very reliant upon Christian mythology, but hope that in the future we just have more and more portal fantasy-esque. I don't know. It would be very cool. I would actually challenge a Jewish writer to write the Jewish Narnia.
There is a book that I feel is kind of like a Jewish answer to Narnia. It is a portal fantasy. The whole thing feels very fairy tale-like, I think a little bit more so than the Narnia books, which feel like a combination of realism with fantasy. But the book I'm thinking of is also new. It's called Tale of the Flying Forest by R.M. Romero.
I just saw that over my feed yesterday. As Jewish authors feel more emboldened to write these kind of stories, I think we're just going to see more and more of them. So maybe the industry is taking more chances on Jewish authors writing joyful Jewish stories and adventurous Jewish stories, and maybe we'll see more and more of this.
It's a trend that has been growing, which makes me happy.
Yes.
In an interview on the blog From the Mixed Up Files of Middle Grade Authors, you said something that made me laugh in recognition. You said, "I've read adult books, but get a little bored with the jaded atmosphere I find in so many of them. I don't really care about adults being down and out or having marriage problems or having a midlife crisis." And I completely agree. So talk about what you do look for in a good read. And also, are there any particular middle grade books, especially any Jewish ones, that you would like to shout out for listeners?
This is why I read middle grade so much, is because it is hopeful. Even when there's challenges, it always ends on a positive note. And I'm a positive person, so it really jives with me so well. As far as books I've read recently, I loved Max in the House of Spies. There's a scene where Max is arguing with his teacher and he talks about, oh, these great Germans. And there's the man who invented the gas mask and saved so many German lives. And then he's like, born to Jewish parents. And then he realizes, like, oh, I got tricked into talking about how great this Jewish man was. And like that just brought tears to my eyes because it was such a wonderful, masterful way to show the ridiculousness of anti-Semitism using real history. I love that one so much.
And I just want to say, Max in the House of Spies, Adam Gidwitz was a guest on the Book of Life in the July 2024 episode, along with Steve Schenken, who wrote Impossible Escape.
I just finished reading that yesterday.
Impossible Escape?
Yes. Oh my gosh. That was one of those books where I'm like, thank God this one won the Sidney Taylor. This is a book that needs to be widely read.
Mm-hmm. Right. It was a Sidney Taylor honor.
That's right. That was the Blood Years.
Right. The Blood Years got the gold
in
the YA category.
Yes. Even in honor. Like this is a book that definitely needs to be read and needs to be circulated. And I don't like reading books about the Holocaust. And I felt kind of compelled to read it. And I'm so glad that I did. I don't know how anyone could read that book and be confused on what constitutes a genocide. I love that it's purely Jewish focus. You know, it's not like helpless, weak Jews depending upon the goodwill of their non-Jewish neighbors. It's so empowering. I don't know. I could cavil about it forever, but and that's great. I just talked about both of the books that were on your podcast.
I love it because you're reinforcing my choices. I'm getting validation from this that you love these same books that I loved.
Yes, all the validation.
I'm going to leave you with homework to listen to these various episodes.
Will do, yeah.
Listeners, come and hang out with me. During November 2024, there are 2 ways we can spend some time together. You can bid on my Jewish Joy reading party at the Artists Against Anti-Semitism auction, which takes place November 13th to 20th, 2024, to have me host a private virtual event for you and your friends. And you can join me for Cheering on Jewish Books, a free online talk that I'm giving on November 20th, 2024 at 7 p.m. Eastern. Details are in the show notes at bookoflifepodcast.com. I can't wait to see you. Now, back to our creature double feature conversation. What was easy about writing your books and what was hard? What was the biggest challenge for either or both of your books?
One of the biggest challenges is being able to hit save, submit. In the military, we'll say you're always improving your foxhole, like a dug in position. Once it's dug out, it's like, okay, well, I can make a stand right here where I can actually stand up and look out, or I can make myself a little seat, add some dirt and form a seat. And that's kind of the way I look at writing. I will build the foxhole, but then I'm always like, oh, but I could do this. And that could be a little worded differently. And I'm not unhappy with it, but I'll keep playing with it until it's time to fill in the foxhole and move out.
What's the easiest thing about writing these books?
I literally only write when I want to, when everything is really in sync, when I have time to write and a good song and a very, very, very specific image in my head. Like I wrote the first draft of Don't Want to Be Your Monster in 2 weeks. I was just so activated, and that feeling of just being in the zone, like from the movie Soul, where you're transported into a different dimension and you're so incognizant to everything around you because you are truly fulfilling your soul's work. Writing is just complete joy, which is why I don't force it. I don't make myself write every day. And for some people, they have to, and that's totally valid. But for me, the easiest part of writing is being in that world and being in that moment and letting everything I imagine just flow through my fingers. It's just perfection.
It's Tikkun Olam time. What action would you like to call listeners to take to help heal the world?
Especially because Benji Zeb is a book with a very strong environmental sub-theme. I would just really encourage listeners to donate to an organization like Wolf Haven, a wolf sanctuary that I based my wolf sanctuary on, that's here in Tenino, very close to where I live. Or another keystone predator that I mentioned in Benji Zeb is the sea otter, which drastically transformed the Monterey Bay when they were reintroduced. The ecology was literally declared dead. The bay itself was completely dead. There was barely any life in the entire bay. And the sea otter came in, and now there's kelp forests and sharks and fish and dolphins and whales come by and seals, and everything lives there now because of the otter. So learning what you can do to help spread awareness of the importance of keystone species and predators, usually get such a bad rap. In Washington, we have organizations that address the concerns of ranchers as well as the concerns of environmentalists. And the state helps to sponsor these conversations where everyone's arguments can be heard and kind of teased through to find common ground that everyone can feel like they can move forward together with. And I guess that's probably the greatest Tikkun Olam message I could offer.
What are you working on next?
Oh my goodness. So I have written a picture book biography of Marilyn Monroe about her life being Jewish and finding a very strong community that accepted her in the Jewish people of New York.
Marilyn Monroe was Jewish?
Yes, she converted. She had moved to New York City to attend an acting school. And while she was there, she had no place to stay. So she stayed with a Jewish family that never treated her like a celebrity. They invited her to family picnics and Shabbat dinner. And when she met Arthur Miller and got married, a lot of people think that she converted to marry him. She actually converted after the marriage. But even after she divorced, she always had a mezuzah on the door. She specified she wanted a Jewish burial, which was not respected, but her entire estate was gifted to the Jewish families that had helped her in New York.
I had no idea.
Yes, so many people don't have an idea. So that's why I wrote the book.
That's amazing.
I am writing, or I should say rewriting, the book of my soul. Like, it is the first book I tried to query. It landed absolutely flat. Like, nobody wanted it. And I have grown so much as an author that now when I look at it, I'm like, oh, I see everything that was wrong with this now. So I'm going back and editing that. This is a critique of militarized systems in general, but also I play on the camaraderie found in the people that are in these situations now that I am a civilian. I find nothing at all that can even slightly compare to the strange sort of camaraderie that you find there, highlighting the good and also discussing the absolutely bad aspects of militarized systems. And it's about a boy who has the dybbuk of his mother attached to him, compelling him to always have this sense of justice. So when you see things bad happening, he always feels like super compelled to throw himself in there. And kind of by accident, he dies and goes into a weirdly militarized afterlife where people fight and destroy, a physical manifestation of the Yetzer Hara. the physical manifestations of people's negative actions instead of seeing, Yetzer HaTov and Yetzer Hara working together to make people whole. So it's fighting against these systems that view things as pure evil or pure good and how that can be really dangerous.
It's reminding me of the Star Trek episode from the original series. I don't remember the name of the episode, where Captain Kirk is divided. Something goes wrong with the transporter, and basically he gets divided into two versions of himself, his Yetzer Tov and his Yetzer Hara.
Yes!
And neither one can really survive without the other one. They need the combination.
Yeah, that's such a Jewish idea. How relevant is it today that we want to believe that there's just black and white, good and evil? There's no middle ground, no conversation. But there are people that don't understand or are misled or have good hearts but are being manipulated. And those are the kind of people that we have to try to reach out to and listen to their concerns, even if they're founded in things that are not always correct. Their feelings are very, very, very real, and finding ways to build those bridges.
Wow, that's going to be interesting. I hope it gets published.
And I wrote a young adult novel in verse about that time when I was a punk rock hitchhiker sleeping on roofs. I wrote a fictionalized memoir of that time of my life.
Where can listeners learn more about your work?
Instagram, that's probably my biggest social media. It's Deke Writes Stuff. And I do have a website, just dekemoulton.com, that I also post links to things like interviews or podcasts.
Deke Moulton, thank you so much for talking with me.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. This was an absolute pleasure.
My Creature Double Feature two-part series about anti-Semitism and the supernatural continues with Emmy Watanabe Cohen. Here's Emmy.
Hi, this is Emmy Watanabe Cohen, author of The Lost Ryu and Golem Crafters. I'll be joining you soon on the Book of Life podcast. I'd like to dedicate my episode to the same people to whom I dedicated Golem Crafters, my grandparents, Stan and Marion Cohen, who have been the cornerstone of my Jewish identity for my whole life.
Say hi to Heidi at 561-206-2473 or bookoflifepodcast@gmail.com. Check out our Book of Life podcast Facebook page or our Facebook discussion group, Jewish Kidlit Mavens. We are occasionally on Twitter too at Book of Life Pod. Want to read the books featured on the show? Buy them through bookshop.org/shop/bookoflife to support the podcast and independent bookstores at the same time. You can also help us out by becoming a monthly supporter through Patreon. Additional support comes from the Association of Jewish Libraries, which also sponsors our sister podcast, Nice Jewish Books, a show about Jewish fiction for adults. You'll find links for all of that and more at bookoflifepodcast.com. Our background music is provided by the Freilach Makers Klezmer String Band. Thanks for listening, and happy reading!
For Sharon, the word of the day is clandestine. It is 1968 France, and she is in charge of sneaking in Israeli men and setting them up quietly in the port of Cherbourg. Naval ships are being built there for the Israeli army, but the French government is refusing to release them. Sharon is busy getting men settled and finding food for everyone, but not so busy that she can't work on a clandestine project of her own. She learns that her commander, Daniel, had been brought to Israel from France as a child in the Youth Aliyah program. Since Sharon's mother had come from France on the same program, Sharon was intrigued by Daniel's experience. He, however, was focused on Israel's future and not on his personal past. When Sharon persists in her questions and secret investigation, she unearths information that could rock his world. Join me for a conversation with Talia Carner about her latest book, The Boy with the Dragon Tattoo. Find us at jewishlibraries.org/nicejewishbooks.